So I started researching this, and I wanted to bring it to you complete. And that's not going to happen. Because naively, when I started to look into this stuff and break it down and process it and document it, it's complicated. And it's going to be a living item on the website, such as all things occult and esoteric. So today's topic, we're going to discuss the moon god in ancient Assyria and Babylon, the Babylonian deity. And why I say it's complicated is because there's a lot of dynamics into it. So, well, I'm not going to explain it. Let's just get into it, right? Let's just do it. So, let's start this off. Oh, art thou, Luna, intense, passionate, still cold, a kiss tainted with hollow emotion, careful and glamouring, your dreams while I lie slumbered, your silvery rays of night's abode filtering the divine noon, splendor like the art of a child, etheric manipulation of earth's tidal course, cleanse thy world by night and purify the dawn's awakening, dream to a new tomorrow through my slumber. Little poem I put together about the moon. So, let's go ahead and let's time travel. Close your eyes unless you're driving a car. Breathe softly. Imagine opening your eyes to a night in a desert oasis. The air is cool and chill. The wind blowing across the dunes in the distance makes an eerie call. The fertility of the land around you is a deep green basking in the moonlight. The stars are bright, candles in the abyss of the heavens. The city around you sleeps, the silence is profound. Ancient Mesopotamia was magnificent and a magical place. The bright ball of night is known as Swin. Suin is pronounced properly, spelt sin, S-I-N, don't get it confused, to the Akkadians, and Nanna to the Sumerians. High above each night, Suin and Nanna appears, moving across the sky, increasing and decreasing in luminosity. A cyclical nature, predictable and foretelling. Tonight the moon is full. Security fills the land, and all can rest sound. So, in ancient Mesopotamia area and region in ancient Babylon and stuff, the Sumerians, they lived south of the Akkadians in the Mesopotamia region. Around 200 years they coexisted, and this is where things get complicated because timelines shift depending on what, scholar you're following and who you talk to. So I invoke the law of E squared. If you don't know what the law of E squared is, the law of E squared states I reserve the right to change my stance based on experience and evidence, or one or the other. So, around 200 years ago, or about 200 years, they've coexisted. And then they started to revolt against each other. So you have the Akkadians, the Babylonians. They start to have kind of this societal collapse because they're fighting. They're trying to expand their territory. Eventually, the Sumerians, what they end up doing is they win, right? So there's kind of this back and forth. The Akkadians beat the Babylonians, and the Akkadians get beat, and then the Akkadians come back, and then we have Samaria. And they eventually pick up the stylus, and they start documenting things again. So in the Samaria culture, Nanna was the son of Enlil and Ninlil, while in the Akkadian, Suin was the father of the gods. And keep in mind, we're talking about the moon here. The creator of all things. It was after the fall of the Akkadian Suin that Nanna started to become more synonymous with the moon and that the archetypal god, right? and that's when the name became more prevalent. Other names are also used in this area, but they're not as well documented as the Swin or Nanna. And but even when they do arrive, you have the root etymology of the name being Nanna. So I don't have the example in front of me. I should, but I don't. But there are several examples that I'll release when I write this up as an actual article. Other than that, basically, if you go a little bit further south, you'll end up in the city of Ur, which was the primary temple spot for Nanna. And, that's where things were primarily held, and the worship of the moon goddess, the moon god, took place. And the reason why I had to specify between god and goddess is because the moon actually didn't become a goddess until early antiquity, when we're talking Greek, Roman, just a little bit before then. It was a male god way back then, which is kind of interesting because you see a trend when we start getting into Roman and Greek, where most of the power comes from the divine feminine, and you have like the feminine cults and stuff. Sorry, I digress there, but we'll get back to that in the future. So it's called the House of the Great Light. That is what the temple is. That's what this means. The important thing to note about the worship of the moon god in ancient Mesopotamia, though, like I just said, it was a masculine association, where in modern times, in early antiquity, it's more of a feminine nature to it. I won't digress into how we can transcend that in non-dualism into the archetypes. We're not going to talk about that, okay? We're not going there. We're going with what we know of the past. So during the I lost my place here. The moon played a significant role in society, in being that it was the society's patriarchal role. It was only natural for it to be the head god in their mind. Because society was patriarchal, the gods were typically male back then. And that's kind of where we get into that social norm of it being patriarchal and gods are men and all that crazy stuff. Other names are, I lost my spot. During the same period, in South Arabia, people of the Hadramaut used the same name for their moon god too. And that's not uncommon either, because I see so many people think that just because they're several hundred or thousand miles, several hundreds of miles away, that it's uncommon for them to utilize the same name. But there is trade being done in these areas. So the South Arabian cultures were trading with the Mesopotamian cultures, and they were trading with the Egyptian cultures. I mean, there was this trifecta of trading going on between them. So the religions would migrate too, and the stories and the cultures will migrate as well. So it's not uncommon to think that the Arabian people would also have the moon god named Nanna, but they're slightly different than the Mesopotamian ones, but it's the same time frame. Because they went all the way to Africa and India and all of this stuff. This was before the Silk Road, but there was still enough trade between civilizations that, cultures would spread. With the Akkadians and the Sumerians, they believed in omens and divination. There's an emphasis on Nanna having to be involved in divination, archetypally illuminating the darkness, right? So if you think about, this is my take on it, side stance from culture, or from history. If you think about the moon as it comes up, and it has a cyclical nature where it'll go from full moon to no moon to full moon, it's illuminating the darkness. And the full moons were benevolent because benevolent's not the right word, but they were good because that's not the right word either. They were looked upon favorably because it illuminated the darkness. They were able to see predators in the night. They were able to see warring invaders coming, so a full moon was helpful to society. It was a good thing to have a full moon. So there's that archetypal symbolism where the moon was involved in divination. Now, Samhain, going back to the Babylonians, it was represented symbolically as an old man. Had a flowing beard. His headdress was adorned with 4 horns, and in the center it mounted the crescent moon. Going back to the cyclical nature of the moons, the path through the sky, and in the correlation to the female menstrual cycle. So they noticed early on that, it's kind of, is boisterous the right word? Kind of, I don't want to be negative, but it's kind of funny how they found out and correlated the cycle nature of the moon to that of the female menstruation cycle, yet the moon god is male. Anyways, they have that association. They have defined the moon god as that god of fertility because of how it correlates to the menstrual cycle. And fertility is directly related to the creation of life. And I say that because if you're not fertile, you're not producing life. End of story. You can't respawn if you're not fertile. And that goes whether you're male or female. It's gender neutral, because if you're not fertile, you can't produce life. At least back then. Don't get into the pseudo-science thought process of creating thought forms as creating essences and entities, or even into the biological aspect of cloning and spawning. That's not what we're going to focus on, because I hear some people out there thinking that right now. But just focus on the time frame and the natural thought process that they're having. Is if fertility is required for the creation of life, thus if something corresponds to fertility, it corresponds to the life creation. If it responds to life, it also has to respond to death. Because if you create something, that something must die. So there's this connection with Nanna and Samhain from the creation cycle to death cycle. And that can also be brought into how the moon goes from new, absent moon, right? But totally blank. There's nothing there. You can't see it. It's darked out. It's dead. To the rebirth of the moon, where it is waxing into the full moon. And then when it gets to the peak climax of life, where it is shine, it's beautiful, it is bringing its rays to the earth for prosperity, it starts to shrink and fade into the darkness as we get old and age. So that is where the concept and the correspondence between the moon and the life and death cycle and the creation get corresponded to that god in ancient Assyria and Babylon. Now, we know that every 38 days, the ancients observed the moon rising and falling into the abode. They knew it went around, but they didn't quite know the true science behind it. True science, we can do a whole episode on that. Whether they believed literally or metaphorically is kind of unclear in these, though. And I want to make that clear because I like to think that they were smarter than we give them credit for. I like to think that they utilized the symbolism and the allegories and the metaphorical stories and gods to relate to the magical interface of life, the things that they couldn't explain at the time. And giving so gives them the act of creation of a thought gives them life. It creates them. And as we learn through the moon, in more of a modern sense, the moon being the focal point of the planetary energies of creation, you can see where that ties in. So them defining the moon god as the creation god is very, they were the originators. Is that a word? They were the origin to that thought. And I like to think that they knew that they knew that their thought process and their worship was creating these, it's not well, in a way it's an egregore, but it's not. They're creating these gods. They have manifested these gods through their energy, their minds, their prayers, and their worship. And now these gods were to assist them through the struggles they had in life, just like we pray to our modern gods. So that's kind of what I like to think about on that aspect of it. Something else that was interesting is they also had the belief that the moon and the moonlight can precipitate conception. So it's kind of like having sex under a full moon. It gives you, that's probably their thought, where go do it then and you'll be more fertile. You'll end up having that baby. So it's interesting that they thought that the moonlight would bring more fertility to you and bless you with conception. But that ties into the cyclical nature of the menstrual cycle, because there are points in the month where a woman becomes more fertile than other times, and that's modern science. So they could have discovered through obviously observation that a magician or an alchemist could be monitoring the moon's position to how your wife bodily functions work, and they can tell you, oh, do this when the moon is doing this and you'll increase your chances of getting a baby. So it's interesting that they had that correlation as well. And then that's how they started developing these correspondences, and that's how we become a thought process and how the moon becomes symbolic to these things. So going back to the name of the moon, so we know that it's Nanna for the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and they're the patron of the city. It is, I think of the Ugarites, it's Yara. And then, Sawin is the patron of Haran, and these are cities, right? It's Kahusha of the Hurrians, Elumnauka of the Sabians of Yaman, and the Samoa of the Indo-Aryan. So this goes into, so we have a lot of diversification between, the different names and stuff, but they're all pretty much associated with the same concept, the same archetypal energy. Now, let's look into a little bit of the Indo-Aryan myths associated around this. So they have this thing called the Hymn of Man, and this is still around this time frame that we're speaking of. The primordial atom is sacrificed to become the diversity of the world. Now, although the sun is in his eyes, it is the moon who is in his mind. Right? This is an excerpt from the Hymn of Man. So it's like the moon is the visionary. The moon is what the mind is reflecting. So if we stay dualistic and we think of the sun as day, the moon as night, and the sun is the outward expression of life, whereas the moon is like the controller. But it's kind of like behind the scenes. It's the thing that follows. So we only see the outside first before we see the inside of something when we're looking at something. And then you need to go inwards to see yourself reflecting outwards. So the moon is like reflectant of the mind. Now, the Persians and the Indo-Aryans, the tradition they speak of is kind of ancient. It's this visionary drink that also helps stimulate this, and this drink is associated with the moon. And that's interesting because I'm listening to a book right now called The Immortality Key, where it goes into the psychotropic ingredients in antiquity with the wine and the beers and stuff, and how they were used in ceremonies. So this is kind of interesting because soma is a mushroom, and it's mixed and drank from these wines and stuff. And keep in mind that the liquor of this day, the liquor from back then, is nothing compared to now because of the distillation process and how we refine it. So it would not be as intoxicating back then as it is now, so you'd need more to become intoxicated. So adding things like this into the wine helps add a different property to the relief, right, without being fully drunk. So this mushroom, this fungus, it gets added to the drink of this part of the world. And they say that the soma is source of the immortal knowledge, and that the moon god is part of this. And that's what's portrayed in the Hymn of Man. I didn't read the whole thing. I'm not going to sit here and you listen to me read poems. But basically that's what the Hymn of Man's about. In another excerpt from it, as I just said, I wasn't going to read it. We have drunk the soma, we have become immortals. We arrived at the light, we have found the gods. And that's a transliteration from the hymn. So the soma is associated with the moon. And I haven't really dug into this. And this is why I said this is complicated, because I can dig into so many angles, and I'll be researching for years to give you one podcast. That's why I'm just throwing it out there. But what I think, and the path of research that I would encourage people to take, is to look at the soma plant and see how it correlates to the moon on their own and find the correspondences. I would assume that for some reason, on a full moon or a night with the moon visible, the plant is more easily distinguishable or easily defined. It's a big mushroom that's red and white. You can't miss it during the day either. But I'd imagine there was some type of correlation between the moon and the mushroom, and that's when they found it, they realized that, oh wow, this unlocks my mind. I don't condone drugs, by the way. You do you, but I'm not going to remain responsible for anything you do. So that's what I'm thinking. So they also, in this part of the world, found that this mushroom unlocks the mind and brings you to these visions and hallucinations of deities, or what they believe to be deities. Yep. And then there's a poem about the divine mushroom of immortality, which is crazy because this correlates so much into the immortality key that I'm listening to, and I did not intend that to happen. So let's move forward a little bit, and we're not going to talk too much about the history of the cities, because this is not a history course in that sense. We're talking about the moon. I got my notes here, and a lot of them is about who ruled and who took over and how that worked. And see, this is the detail I get into, and it just analysis paralysis, and I got to break that. Now, there's something else that I wanted to bring up about the moon, though, was because we've been discussing it for a while as being masculine, but I don't give it enough credit for the femininity of it, because even the Assyrians and the Akkadians and all that area, they recognized that there is a feminine aspect to it. Obviously, the primary part's the man, but there's a feminine counterpart to it. So Nanna had a counterpart. He had a love, as most people find love in this world. Nana loved his consort. It's the moon goddess Nangal. Now, I know what you're saying is, yo, you just told us that there wasn't, and that there's only men gods. Yes, I did, but this is a little bit later in the Assyrian timeline, a little bit later. This is where it gets complicated. Once again, you're checking off dates and you're looking to who says what, when, and where, and how, and what does this get interpreted symbol as. So, I did say that, but now we're we're moving up in history, right? So, now we have a moon goddess, Ninlil. Nanna fell in love with Ninlil, goddess of the reeds, and she with him. It was this joyful and impetuous union that Nanna, goddess of love and sensual fertility, the morning and evening star, and Uta, the sun god, were born. Okay? So that was the creation of the sun god and the goddess of love, were created from Nanna and Ninlil, which is the goddess of the reeds. And she's not really well known. She's talked about, but she's not put on a pedestal like some of the other gods are. So that's kind of, what I'm saying is it's patriarchal. It's not necessarily pushed on for that. Now, if you're following what I just said about Inanna, you'll realize two things. One, Nanna is in the name Inanna, and Inanna was the morning and evening star. That should be shooting off bells for people. One, because you have derivative of the name Nanna, so it's a child of the moon god. And two, it's Venus. This corresponds to Venus, the morning and evening star, because that's what Venus is. We're not talking about Venus yet. We're going to get to that in another podcast. But for now, we're focusing on the moon god for several podcasts. So this is something to keep in mind for the future. All right. Good stuff. Now, we're going to when we're talking about this stuff, we're going to diverge a lot, and we're going to get off topic, and that's just how it's going to be. Because what we're going to discuss now is how the Shoin from the Babylonian, so we're stepping back in history a little bit here, and Shamash and Ishtar, they formed a trinity of deities. Now, this will play into when we start getting into Roman, Greek mythology, and in Catholicism and the other three big religions when we start talking about trinities. Because the Trinity plays a big factor in many, not many, but the bigger religions that plays a big factor in. And this is where the concept came from. So what you end up happening here is you have Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar actually being the second trinity of the deities. I apologize if I messed it up for the first time, because there's two. There's the first trinity and then there's the second trinity. But regardless, this is how the trinities get divided or defined in future religions. The first trinity of the gods, they were absorbed into the lunar cycle, becoming the phases of the moon, thus giving the moon a supreme role. And that's why they believe the moon is the god of gods. And it's the connecting principle between the deities and mankind. The moon is during the period of his visibility in the first 5 days, the god Anu. From the 6th to the 10th day, the god Ea. And from the 11th to the 15th day, the god Enlil. The Trinity was also adopted by the Assyrians and the Akkadians alongside their patron deities, the other names for the moon. So you have to question here. You have the Trinity of the gods for the phases of the moon, and then you have the second Trinity where Shoin, Shamash, and Ishtar are involved. So Shoin is the moon god. in Babylonian lore. But now they're a second trinity, and the moon god is the first trinity. You see why I'm sitting here just talking this through now with you guys? Because I can spend years breaking this down and trying to put it in logical form. So keep that in mind, because this is how the Trinity got formed. This is how things worked forward. In the phases of the moon, they're broke into the different aspects. Now, when you break down the different phases of the moon with what the individual gods represent, then you start learning about how the phases of the moon represent different aspects of, the creation and destruction properties of the moon that we have today. Now, we didn't really talk about Soan's etymology. So the Sumerian word basically meant knowledge. It's the Lord of Knowledge. That's what the moon was. Keeper of knowledge, Lord of knowledge. So this Lord of Knowledge in the Babylonian, Assyrian, Akkadian time frames here, it became, very observant that the lunar cycle, it was predictable. It was all coming and going, waxing and waning. They knew and could predict it. So they gave a special connection with Samhain over order. They had a very order presentation, right? Like it knew how to do it, what it needed to do, when it needed to do it. And wisdom and immortality, because it wasn't going anywhere. It had a cycle. It would die into nothingness and then be rebirthed into fullness. So it had mortality to it, or immortality. So now we have the correspondence from them that correlate the number 7 to the lunar, section of it, which is right and wrong, I believe, but I don't want to break down why. I mean, just think about how the lunar cycle works. I believe it's like every, it's 28 days, so every 14 days in between each cycle, so that's 2 weeks, so you have 4 segments of it, so every 7 days you have some kind of changes, right? So you can break it down that way, so like basically full moon to waxing crescent to, new moon to waning crescent to, actually I got that backwards, but you know what I mean. So they come up with the 7 as the number of the moon. So that's where we get the correspondence there with it. But they also tie this into the 7 levels of hell, the 7 great planets, the moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They were aware of these, which is absolutely impressive, if you ask me, because they didn't have telescopes. They didn't have anything back then. We didn't have telescopes till Galileo. So they were aware of all of these, and they have assigned those aspects to gods, which we'll get into later in a different podcast. And they were big about hymns and poetry to the gods. That's kind of how their magic worked. Was the prayers were hymns or poems to the deities of it. Now, we know the moon god had a daughter, Inanna, and it's also known by Ishtar of Babylon, Atharat of the Canaanites, Aluza of the Arabians, Hathor of Egypt, and guess what, guys? Hecate of Greece. We'll get there in a little bit. It's a complex, and this is how we get confused in the scenarios, because we start naming these things, and then everyone wants to name them something different. So the idea is that Nanna and Ninlil had this child, and that name was either Inanna, Ishtar, Atharat, Aluza, Hathor, or Hecate. Those are the known ones currently that I have written down. There's probably more. So depending on where you are in this part of the world at this time, remember they're all talking, they're all trading. You had these different names. Now, the key here is that there's some gender difficulties with these because, everyone wants to be right. Everyone wants to have what they believe to be correct, right? So Hecate's female. Ishtar is female. I don't think Hathor is in the Babylon or in Egypt. I'm not 100% on that. I have the right to be wrong. And so they start doing all this, and then you have the emergence of monotheism later in history that starts to rewrite some of this stuff. And they claim that's the downfall of Eden, and ultimately the patriarchal tradition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam start to form later on. Now, we're branching off there a little bit and just kind of giving you insight where we're going in the future episodes. But ultimately, you can follow the moon into, I think, and once we get into these episodes, I'll correct us if it's wrong, but I think all the way up to like the Virgin Mary type scenarios. But don't stand me on that just yet, because I haven't fully vetted my research onto that point yet. But the moon is also associated with ancestor worship and sacred tombs and stuff as well. There's a correlation to this inside of the ancient world. To kind of finish this up a little bit here and kind of wrap it up with the moon in Babylon, because there's not much more I can discuss on the correspondence levels or kind of the history a little bit without going on tangents and spending hours. Ultimately, Soin gets replaced by Nanna, and that's the path that is taken from history next. But what's interesting is Soin has a very complex nature. Soin is a masculine god. It doesn't really have the feminine counterpart to it, but Nanna does. And we can see the evolution of society at this point, because we start to see the respect may not be the right terminology, because I think yes, the feminine respect. I think that would work, because you start to see the feminine respect there. Because with the Nanna and Ninlil story, you have this concept of continuing love between them, and this, unification until death, and the cyclical nature of that. And then out of that love spawns the female offspring, Ishtar, or Inanna. And from that, you have this female offspring. And this to me, is a very crucial division, because you didn't have a son, you had a daughter. And this represents male mortality, I believe. Because obviously it takes two to tango, but we don't have the option to hold and create. Only the female counterpart does. So we start to see this migration into sexual fertility and these feminine cults about fertility and, cyclical natures of life and creation. And that's where we start to see Ishtar and Nanna going as the creation between Nanna and Ninlil. Okay? So we start to see the understanding that fertility and two are a good thing, and that we need that. So we start to see the full perspective of the moon being the fertility god or goddess, and the creation aspect of that. It's through their love that creation is created. Okay? So now we start to see why we have some symbolism that we do with the moon as far back as Babylon. So Nanna is later kind of pushed back aside for the female fertility rites, as we just discussed. And then we start to see how Ishtar of the Sumerians starts to become a lunar deity. Now you notice with all the name changes and everything, Ishtar is Nanna, which is the daughter of, Nanna and Ninlil. So, we've seen this, and there's scholars that have seen the link between this and the evolution of Swin to become the monotheistic god of the Semnites and Noah. Right? There's a teaser there. Some scholars believe that The moon god of the Babylonians evolved to be Yahweh. And doing my research, I can see why. I'm not necessarily saying I hold that same belief, but I can understand from the scholarly standpoint of why they would make those assumptions. And, going back to the illumination aspect of the moon, it's the light between the worlds. It's the illumination of heaven and earth. And you'll see shortly after this period, probably in 5 to 1,000 years after this period, you'll start to see the evolution of the Kabbalistic ideas and how the moon plays in to the transcendent nature of the soul and the body, and how you have to go through the moon first before you really go through anything else. So you can start to see that nature. Illumination is not only about physical light, it also, in their mind, was revealing the will of the gods, basically the messenger passing down the information. It was the only planet that was actively seen consistently. Keep that in mind in the framework, is that this was nightly, where all your other planets, they were seen, but they were a speckle in the distance. They knew that they were special because of the rotation and how they worked and the way that they didn't shimmer like the other planet or other stars do. Because when you're looking at stars, you can tell a planet from another star, because a star will have a Doppler effect to it and its light will shift and shine because it's pulsing, because it's a gas burning in the distance, and so it has fluctuation. So a non-star, a planet, will not do that. And that's how they were able to distinguish between the two. But what would be more awe-inspiring? The little dot that doesn't do anything but move, or this huge ball in the sky next to the sun? Well, not literally next to the sun, but they're both out. That comes through every night, and it shifts course, and it goes away, and it comes back, and it rotates through the sky on different axes. It was more dynamic, it was more telling than the sun, because the sun was consistent. The sun was there every day, and except for eclipses, it never really changed except on its axis. Whereas the moon was more dynamic. So that's why this moon, in my opinion, and through my research, would be more dynamic, would be more godlike, would be more important, because the changes of the moon is a messenger. And that leads us to the end of today's podcast, and at least this segment. Next up, we're going to talk about the angel of the week. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much.